I'm George Galloway, and I present كلمة on Mayadeen television. Here we are in London. I speak my words freely, either in Parliament, on television, here on the streets of London. كلمة means free word. That's what I speak. So كلمة is a two-way conversation. Check it out on Mayadeen television. Welcome to كلمة with me, George Galloway, for Mayadeen television, coming to you from London, discussing Libya. We have an audience of distinguished experts and one or two enthusiastic amateurs like me. Let me put my cards on the table. Other cards are available. I have never met any of the family of the late Colonel Gaddafi. Neither have I met the late Colonel. I had nothing to do with the regime in Libya, and I was very far from being a supporter of it. But my view is that the NATO invasion, destruction of Libya has succeeded in making a bad job much, much worse. I have been in Libya more than once during the reign of the late Colonel Gaddafi. I was not impressed, though I recognize that there are people in this audience who were impressed. I recognize also that there were things to be impressed about. But given the smallness of Libya's population and the vast ocean of oil that the country produced, every person in Libya should have been a multi-millionaire, and the public realm should have looked like Dubai, and neither of those was true. But the NATO intervention, as they call it, in the civil conflict in Libya, has succeeded in transforming what was bad and ramshackle into a million pieces. It's my view that Libya is now no longer a country. It's no longer a state. There are several Libyas. There are several parliaments. There are several governments. There are several prime ministers. But there are no state. There are no security. There are no borders. And that is a catastrophe for the people of Libya and its neighbours, and also for the European Union and its countries, because in blowing away the previous regime in Libya, the doors were blown open, and across and through which have come literally millions of refugees who have, if they were lucky in being able to cross the Mediterranean Sea, were left in dire misery. And the rise of populist, anti-immigrant, anti-refugee sentiment in all of the European countries involved, but particularly along the southern lip of the European side of the Mediterranean, is well known, I think, to everyone. So it's my view that the NATO intervention and the NATO-sponsored murder, gruesome murder of the late Colonel Gaddafi have been a catastrophe for Libyans and for everyone else. As to whether Libya will ever be a single country again, I have my doubts. But of one thing I have no doubt. The idea that the destruction of Libya would herald an era of democracy for Libya is simply laughable. Democracy cannot be conjured forth by imperialist invasion and destruction on the point of foreign guns. And I've been proven right in that prediction in the years since the overthrow of the previous Libyan regime. Why we did it? I'm not so sure. I have my views on why President Sarkozy was so involved. If I'm forced to, I'll give them. He is the subject of criminal proceedings at this very moment. As to why David Cameron got involved, as to why Britain and France dragged, and I believe they did drag, the United States administration into full-throated support for one or other brand of Islamist extremism, it's beyond my education. It's beyond my pay grade. The idea that by empowering, supporting, arming, financing one strain of Islamist fanaticism or another, or more than one at the same time, the logic of that simply defies belief for me. I give just one last observation that might not be known to all of the international audience. There was a group called the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, the clue was in the name, that were cosseted by the British state and encouraged to go and live en masse in Manchester. I knew them. I knew them quite well. One of their sons blew up in a suicide mission the Manchester Arena during an Ariana Grande concert, and I was merely a few hundred yards away from the venue when the explosion occurred. It was mass murder of young children and their mothers mainly, and fathers in one or two cases too. It was done by a son of the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, a group sponsored by the British government, sent to fight in Libya by the British government, allowed to move back and forward between Britain and Libya by the British government. Some called it a liberation. I say that the gates of hell were opened by the British government and the NATO governments in the destruction of Libya. Those are my cards. Other cards are available. Let's see some of them now. Jonathan.
So I'm Jonathan Fryer, writer and broadcaster on the Middle East and North Africa and frequent visitor to Libya during the Gaddafi years. I think I take one issue with you, George, in that, yes, of course, what's happened to Libya since the NATO involvement has been a disaster. But we have to remember that before that, there was a genuine uprising in Benghazi of people, many of whom were not Islamic fundamentalists, who were basically wanting a new sort of Libya. And the reason that NATO decided to get involved, perhaps now in retrospect they did it very wrongly, was because those people were then threatened quite overtly by Gaddafi's son, Saif al-Islam, on television. We will go in, rip them out of their cupboards and kill them. And so David Cameron thought this is an opportunity for responsibility to protect. International community must stop what will otherwise be a massacre. But of course things then turned extremely nasty, and one can only hope that we learn from this mistake on how to react to those sorts of situations in the future, because there will be others.
Just let me test you on one or two of those points, Jonathan, because you are an expert. What was it about the Muslims in Benghazi that so captured the hearts of David Cameron that the plight of the Muslims in Gaza never did?
I think we have to recognise that this was part of what was wrongly called the Arab Spring, what I prefer to call the New Arab Awakening, that began in Tunisia in December 2010 and started to sweep across. And what we saw in Benghazi, which has always been remote from Tripoli and very opposed to Gaddafi when he was in power, we saw hundreds of thousands of people, ordinary people, going into the street and crying out for a new sort of country, for democracy, all these sorts of things.
That happens at the fence every Friday in Gaza.
Well, you and I would agree on Gaza, I'm sure, because we are both strong supporters.
But NATO would never bomb Israel.
No, indeed. But I think we have to accept that there was this real hunger for change in Libya. And the horrible thing is that it's all gone terribly wrong.
Describe what the situation is now from your point of view.
Well, as you mentioned in your introduction, the country is now essentially in different parts with different administrations, and several areas are now really not under the rule of law at all. There are all sorts of factions, some Islamist, some more warlords, we would call them in the old terminology of the 20th century. And basically, what hasn't happened has been really a suitable opportunity to bring everyone together. And then, of course, we've had the intervention of Haftar and the attempt basically to seize power by one particular group supported by certain countries in the Arab world, which make the whole situation extremely explosive.
How do you characterize Haftar?
He's a warlord, basically. He wants to be the big boss. He's different in character, perhaps, from Gaddafi, but basically he would love to have a situation in which he is in control and that basically then you have a sort of military discipline in the country. And although it needs political discipline, whether it needs a sort of military-led government is quite another matter.
And which countries did you have in mind when you said he was being supported by certain countries?
Well, we know that he's had support from some of the Gulf countries and that there has been money sent to him and also political support. So
Trump called him famously. He telephoned him, I mean. He didn't just tweet him. What was that all about?
Well, Trump likes to dabble in different parts of the world. I mean, this is something that American presidents have done for generations. And I suppose basically he would like to try to see if there's some way that he, under the Trump presidency, could bring about a solution in Libya. I think by putting his finger in there, he's begun to understand that it isn't as easy as that, and that actually external involvement at a government level is only likely to make things worse.
You think he's deleted his phone number now?
He probably has it still there somewhere.
Sir.
This is Dr. Abdulaziz Dou. It's a Libyan analyst and journalist. First of all, let me thank you, Mr. George Galloway, for your invitation to your show. Second things, when we talk about Libya, and I am Libyan, we talk with the heart broken, actually, especially we talk about Libya, what happened in my country here in London. It's make every Libyan nationalist sad because we need to solve our problem internally between our parts. But the Libyan problems, actually, it has two elements. One element is internal element. Second element is the external element, including Turkey, Gulf states, and around us. That's the local. The international, when we talk international, we're talking about who's controlled the Security Council. The internal problem in Libya, there's a mislead information still using until today after 10 years of the previous regime has been collapsed. A mislead and mistruths. Yes, Libya has oil reserve, has gas reserve, low population, you're talking about 6 million, and a massive land, you're talking about 2 million square meter, is a massive land. So when you talk about Libya's non-developments, there's no education, there's nothing in the ground, absolutely is wrong. Libyan people, they know that's wrong. What we call it around happened at that era, 2011, which is called Arab Spring. All we know as an Arab, which has been directly affected with that, either Tunisian people or Libyan people or Egyptian, they call it now is a very hot summer, North African summer. If you've been in North Africa, you know what the summer means. Because what had happened to the economic state now in Tunisia? Nothing. What's happened in Libya? Chaos, as you explain it. Libyan people, they try hard, but because the external elements which related to the Islamic Brotherhood and the Islam, who's thinking in Turkey, for example, sponsoring the Islamics, and Qatar as well, a lot of monies, and the other part who is against the Islamic fanatics controlling the region. They try to force Egypt, is being kicked out from Egypt. Now they are try to hold firmly Libya because it is a reserve for a lot of money to proceed their agenda, which is control the Islamic world and the Arab world. Is sponsored by Turkey, not by Turkish people, but by the Prime Minister and his party now. Probably when he fell out or get kicked out from the government, the Turkey will return to her previous face, which is very liberal country is not related with the Islamic fanatics. Today, we need the truth. The truth, our country was going forward slowly but steady to solve their problem, to do many things in the way. Unfortunately, emotionally, some people, they say that's the Arab Spring has happened in Tunisia and Egypt is good for Libyan people. And we know that the Libyan political scene in Libya, it's actually is a social, because we are not a mature society like a Western. We are tribal, family, know how our country work inside out. When we talk about General Khalifa Haftar, we need to talk about the Libyan National Army. He is the latest of the hierarchy officer in the Libyan army, but now he is now collecting the national army. And now all the Libyan people behind that army, despite Colonel Khalifa Haftar is on the top of that army.
Let's take a different point of view from another Libyan. Sir, how do you respond to the discussion so far?
Well, my name is Sabri Malik. I'm from the Democratic Party of Libya. We are a secularist party. We want to see Libya become like Switzerland in a matter of 40 years.
Now, that is a vision.
Yes, that's what we work for. Now, Libya is going through a lot of problems, and they are the problems of the Arab Spring, of course. We in the Democratic Party try to focus on the ideological side of the problem, because Libya, as the whole Arab world, is divided by two ideologies, the Arab nationalism and fundamentalism. Arab nationalism is almost dead, but we do have a problem with fundamentalism. We in the Democratic Party say that in order for the Arab Spring to succeed, we have to make a clear break with our past, with our theocratic past. We cannot have democracy while we still think in theocratic terms. Democracy and theocracy are mutually exclusive. The fundamentalists don't understand that. Some of them want democracy, but they hold theocratic ideas. So we are saying is that Islam is democratic. It's not theocratic. It happened to be historically theocratic because of the absence of democracy. For historical reasons, we have failed to establish democracy, but we must not remain prisoners to that. We have to look forward to a democratic future. We have a lot of faith in the young generations of the Arab people. They are very much influenced by Western thought. They have access to Western media. The social media is helping a lot. And we are very hopeful that in a matter of perhaps 10 years or so, we are going to have a clear cut with the past, and we will go for democracy rather than remain theocratic.
Now, the last time we spoke, and indeed we clashed, it became quite a famous clash. You thanked David Cameron and President Sarkozy for attacking your country. Do you still feel that way?
The thing is that NATO helped us get rid of Gaddafi, but we are thankful for that. However, the West did not want democracy in Libya. They wanted to remove Gaddafi and keep his stooges. They supported the counter-revolution from day one. And this is why we're having problems in Libya. 8 years after the fall of Gaddafi, we still have major problems. These problems are the result of a lot of foreign interference. The West does not want democracy in Libya. And because of that, we are suffering.
With all respect, I told you that at the time.
Just let me finish this. Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and Egypt are very much involved in trying to destroy democracy in Libya, the fledgling democracy in Libya.
There is no fledgling democracy in Libya.
What
is
we
this?
are working for it. We are working for it
It's
despite...
not fledgling, it's still an egg.
We are working for it despite of what the West wants and despite of what the axis of evil, the Arab axis of evil want, which is Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and Egypt.
Are you still on Social Security in Britain?
It's none of your business.
You're an international lawyer, sir. You know about the region well. You're also Turkish, if I may say.
That's correct.
How do you respond to people who say that you're all an axis of evil and that you are like vultures, really, picking at the corpse of Libya?
Some people, they thank Sarkozy and David Cameron and others for overthrowing their own leader. Okay, throwing your own leader is fine, but your country is obliterated, divided into 1,000 pieces. Is it going to be democracy? Forget it. Show me a democratic country in any Arab state. There's no such thing as democracy. Now, coming to Turkey, why Turkey intervened? Turkey has not intervened as such. Remember when overthrow of the Gaddafi took place, Turkish president, at the time Prime Minister Erdogan, now president, was asked to support. The simple question he asked, what business do they have there? Why they want to overthrow Gaddafi? And then he was forced to support the invasion of Libya by so-called NATO countries to bring democracy to Libya as they did to other Arab countries. Now, Turkish interference recently, if we're talking about the General Haftar, who's General Haftar? Who is he? He was with Gaddafi when they had the revolution against King Idris. They worked together. If there was a ramshackle of the country during Gaddafi's regime, he was responsible as well, because he was party to it. Then he escaped and went to the United States. What did he do for 20 years in the United States? He was educated and trained to return after the collapse of Gaddafi to divide his own country. Now, who is he aligned with? Starting from United Arab Emirates. Are they democratic? Forget it. Saudi Arabia, are they? Egypt, are they? So where is the democracy in the Arab world? The biggest sponsors of the murderous Haftar, who should be tried in the European Court of Human Rights for war crimes, it is him. With the support of United States of America, is one of the supporters, France. So as long as they have that petrol and there is the interest from outside, they will be bound and subdued to the fist of their rulers who are and will be imposed by the outsiders.
Okay. I'll tell you have to permit me to say I told you so. I warned you of all of this, especially those of you who supported the NATO attack on their own country. And by the way, it is my business if you're on Social Security in Britain, because if you are, I'm paying for it. We'll be right back after the break. You're watching كلمة with me, George Galloway, on Mayadeen television, coming from London, talking about Libya. We took the كلمة camera onto the streets of London to see what the people thought. Let's take a look.
Is the US and its allies using General Haftar to start a conflict against Turkey?
I definitely believe that America is using different ways to cause problems within Libya for financial benefit.
It's more about splitting countries apart. So, countries are picking who they're going to back based on what countries are already backing that person. So if we zoom out from Libya, it seems like we're getting a split between major countries in the world, which could potentially obviously lead to a war, as you mentioned.
I would suggest that any kind of alliance by a Western power who's not involved in a conflict in a region has to be questionable. So quite possibly, but I couldn't really say definitively.
Why do you think so many countries are promoting factions in Libya rather than unity?
I think there are people that are, most likely there are people high up in other countries that have other interests in Libya. They can make a personal profit and they're just doing what's best, what they think is best for themselves rather than what's best for the country of Libya.
I don't really want to be pessimistic about it, but I assume it's because there's personal interests and it's involved to do with money and the buying of arms and selling of arms. So I think that comes above all about people's well-being or anything else. I think that's what I think most governments are.
As we know right now, Trump and the US are using their economic and political supremacy to influence the decisions of other countries, such as what's happening in Mexico with the trade agreements there. So, countries, if they're in sort of a trade conflict with the US, they'd want to back who the US is backing because that adds another thorn in the side sort of Trump.
I think there is definitely a political incentive for Western or more powerful countries to promote factions because it tends to give them leverage in situations of potential conflict.
It's to do with the oil, I'm guessing, and the financial benefit and gain from that. You know, where there's turmoil, they can benefit from that. The Western countries, not just America, but countries like the UK and other European countries, they benefit from having corruption and turmoil within these countries so that they can benefit financially.
What a miserable picture, I must say. Let's carry on with the debate. Yes, sir, you have the floor.
My name is Muhil. I am currently a student at City University of London. I am not Libyan, nor have I ever been to Libya. I'm not even Arab myself. But my question to the gentleman from the Democratic Party is, do you think NATO would have intervened as much as they would have done if Libya did not have so much oil? Or do you think, are you that happy sort of siphoning it all off to America and not leaving some for yourself?
I have no idea.
Good answer.
Okay, thanks very much. Gentleman behind you.
Thank you, George. It's Julian. My question is about Russia, who did a lot to prevent a regime change in Syria, but didn't seem to do much or anything to prevent the same thing in Libya.
China and Russia abstained in the Security Council on the endorsement of the NATO action. I don't think they'll ever do that again.
Did you find that strange at the time?
Yeah, I have never discussed it with the Russians, but I did discuss it at the time with the Chinese ambassador to London, who said that there were many different points of view within the Chinese government about what was done in the Security Council. And he indicated that China would never do so again because the permission which they gave by their abstention to claim legitimation from the UN, from their point of view, had been misused. That a no-fly zone is one thing. The total destruction of a country and the wreckage that was then to ensue was quite another.
Thank you.
Lady next to you. Yes,
sorry, I just wanted to clarify something when you said about the Russians were trying to prevent a regime change in Syria. The people of Syria decide who leads their country, who their president is. No one else. Not the British regime, not your regime, not no one. The Syrian people decide, all right? Yeah. That's final. And the Syrian people have decided who their president is. Okay, I was in Syria when it was all kicking off in Libya, and I have to say I was pretty disgusted at the UK, Tammy Al-Kabani, by the way, at how the UK and NATO, how they present democracy to the rest of the world. He was not overthrown. He did not fall. he was murdered in cold blood in the name of democracy. How on earth is that how we're teaching the world our democracy? And the many children of Libya who look to the West for inspiration, 30,000 people, including children, were bombed during the NATO bombing campaign. So for the dead children of Libya who don't have that opportunity to thank the West, maybe they're thanking them from their graves that they no longer have a future, thanks to the West. And talking of Sarkozy, he's been investigated for money laundering. He took 50 million euro from Libya, didn't pay it back, and then he goes in and bombs NATO. I mean, I watched it unfold as I was in Syria, and I just could not believe that this British regime would on earth be able to convince the world that this is an example of democracy. I stood with the most admirable people in Syria who will choose their own destiny, and I watched and in disbelief. And we were talking about the difference between hypocrisy and theocracy. Democracy and hypocrisy. There's a difference between the two. You know, you cannot call democracy when you feel like it and yet use hypocrisy, especially when you're killing people over and over again in the name of democracy. It just doesn't work like that.
Okay.
It doesn't work.
Julian, do you want to just make a response?
Just to say it's a very good point, and I do agree with you. When I said help, I meant that Russia helped the Syrian people, if you like, and maybe it was because Syria is closer to Russia. I don't know, but it's a really good point. The people of a country should decide.
And they are deciding.
Yeah, exactly,
Let's
exactly.
make that clear.
Yeah.
In 2014, in January, when the so-called Geneva Convention was going on, the people had the opportunity to decide, and they decided full stop. And no regime, no British regime, no US regime. An Arab Spring, Arab Revolution is, you know, I'm sorry, but I'm not even sorry. The US and the British regimes need to, when the regime comes to then the revolutions come to their country, as it did to France, let's see, because the French are being silenced.
Let's see who else would like to talk. Gentleman here.
My name is John Georges. I am from Iraq. I have many Libyan friends now and in the 80s when I was a student here. They were my colleague students at the same university where I used to study in Brighton. They didn't have any issues back then. The country was running smoothly. Everybody was happy. Like I was. Some people, they call me Saddami, Ba'thi, because I used to study when Saddam was in power. And they still call these colleagues of mine Gaddafi, because they studied during the Gaddafi era. So this is the situation. What hurts me most is they didn't learn from the Iraq lesson what happened to my country. It happened before Libya, long time before Libya. Why didn't they learn from the Iraqi lesson? Why didn't they learn? Condoleezza Rice, she said, a new world order. This is the new world order, according to American. I still remember when they tried to punish you. They took you to the Congress, but you took them. You punished them. They tried to, at the time, I follow you, George. They said you took tokens from Saddam Hussein, oil tokens, at the American Congress. And you took them to court, your own way. You've never changed. That was the good thing about you, and that's why I follow you, and that's why I love you, and that's why I'm a good friend of yours.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you.
As I always say, Saddam Hussein never gave me a thin dime,
I
but
know.
the media that said that he did gave me millions, mashallah. Let's take another. Yes, gentleman at the back.
Well, my name is George, and I'm from Bulgaria.
Many Georges here. Excellent.
And it happens that I used to work in Benghazi for 3 years, from 87 till when democracy came in the 90s, the beginning of the 90s. So I was in charge of 70 Bulgarian specialists who used to work in Benghazi North power plant. That's a huge power plant that makes desalinated water for the whole of Benghazi. At that time, a lot of new buildings were being built by the Koreans, South Korea, for people to live in. Lots of cars, especially South Korean cars, imported. And in hospitals, there used to be specialists from all over Europe working there. In the desert, Sepkan things, Americans were not allowed to work there, but it was Americans with Canadian passports, specialists, engineers. So there was order at that time. So that's all I can say.
Well, that's a good point. But let me test that here at the front, if I may. I'd like your comment, please, on something that Jonathan said, which is incontestable from my point of view, that Benghazi was a center of opposition. I remember when I took my first convoy to break the siege of Gaza, the people in Benghazi wanted to receive our convoy, but they were not allowed to. We were sent across the desert, so we didn't touch Benghazi. And I knew then that there were political difficulties. This was 10 years before the, well, not quite, but some years, 3 years before the so-called revolution. Isn't it the case that Libya is not one country and that it should never have been one country and can't ever again be one country? Isn't that true?
No, not at all. Libya one country by blood. I'm sitting here. My sister lives in Benghazi. My sibling, they are married to Benghazi people from east. My grandfather, mom from south. I live in Tripoli. I live in Bani Walid in the middle, in the middle of the Libya. My uncle's mother side, brother side, they all over Libya. That is the natural scene for every Libyan. Few of them probably they are local to the same city, but all the Libyans around Libya. Libya is still one country. I assume there is something about your convoy when you head to Gaza, because the point, if you look at the map, there is a one-way route which is help Libyan who is coming from Egypt or from Far East to reach Tripoli quickly. The country built a straight road. I'm sure you are being.
No, that's true. But,
for 600
but people were organizing welcome parties for us in Benghazi, and we were not allowed to go. It's clearly a political decision, not a geographical one to do with the road.
I assume is a geographical, not a political. You have the right to think that's a political.
This is a small matter.
That's a small matter. Other
anyway.
things.
But your point is that Libya is one people. Is that your point?
Libya is a one people. Libya is a one tribe, despite all the mess which is controlling. I mean, when you talk about a country is stateless, and some city live in peaceful. There is no policeman. There is no order. If I kill you in the middle of the street, nobody will run behind me to catch me. What's that mean? That means there's locals. They know each other. We have a few causing a problem, receiving money from outsides. They are desperate to control the main power in the country. Yes, that is our problem today. When we talk the era of the Colonel Gaddafi, you couldn't miss out the great man-made river. You couldn't miss out how he kicked 5 colonies for the air base for United States, United Kingdom, the Italians, colonists who occupied our land. He prevent our people from working in the center of Tripoli during 40s and 30s things. We couldn't ignore the freedom fighter of Omar al-Mukhtar against the Italian colonies. We have a history of resistance. We couldn't ignore it, and we're still working in that piece to just kick out all of the Western interference in our country. We know they are coming with their knives, with their fork, to have a piece of our flesh.
Okay.
And we wouldn't...
Gentleman next to you. And yeah.
I want to go back to the causation of the war and downfall of Muammar Gaddafi, and also destruction of the country and obliteration. Now, obviously, we know for a fact that the causation started with Nicolas Sarkozy, because he borrowed money from Gaddafi himself in order to...
More fool Gaddafi lending him money.
Or he lent him money in order to sponsor his re-election. He could not pay it. We're talking about, I'm not sure what the latest said, 50 million.
It's alleged to be 50 million euros.
But I heard it in the past to be 50, maybe I misheard it. I don't know. The figure is disputed. Regardless of the figure, there was a money issue here. Because he could not repay the money to him, and to save his embarrassment, what did he do? He toppled Muammar Gaddafi. He initiated it. Now, to initiate a war as a perpetrator yourself, as a lawyer, I would suggest and recommend to anybody who is in this room and listening around the world that they should start petition to prosecute the perpetrator, i.e. in this case, Nicolas Sarkozy and others, for destruction of a country and a nation, and not just Libya, and also that applies to Iraq, Syria, and Yemen for that matter.
That's a good legal case. You should take it. Let's hear from this gentleman at the end.
Yes, my name is Osama. I'm from Libya. I have a question to Mr. Sabri and to the other Libyan people who live here in England, that they can't go back to Libya because of Gaddafi. So now Gaddafi, since 2011, died. And I see most of the Libyan people who was against Gaddafi, and I'm sure Mr. Sabri, one of them, they are still lives in London and England. Why they don't go back to Libya and they rebuild the country as they said? And so this is my question to Mr. Sabri.
No? He doesn't want to answer it. Maybe the Social Security is too good here.
I think so, yeah. That's what I agree with you.
Let's see.
Sorry, quickly.
Yeah, briefly, yeah?
Yeah, I just wanted to say the US and NATO allies were very quick to hand out weapons as well to, they're the ones that actually were handing out weapons in Libya, and then the people that were handing out to them refused to give them back. So most of the chaos now with weapons is...
What a surprise.
Yeah.
You give weapons to people that refuse to give them back. Jonathan, let me test one or two of the points that have been raised with you as a dispassionate, relatively dispassionate expert. If, as some think, we invaded Libya in order to get our hands on Libya's wealth, we didn't actually get much because Libya is effectively now not producing. If it was all about Libya's oil, well, there's not much of Libya's oil flowing and being sold in the international market because there's a state of total chaos in the country. All these expats that used to work there and be very well paid there, you'd have to be a very brave expat to go and live and work in Libya now. So what was it all about from the Western point of view? If it was about money, it's backfired, no?
I think there were a number of motives, and perhaps none of them have been successfully realized. Yes, certainly money and control of oil will be in the back of minds of some countries, I think particularly the United States. As I mentioned in my earlier remarks, I think there was a genuine wish from certainly David Cameron to try to stop massacres, but that then basically mutated into regime change, which should never have been on the menu, because it really is not for outside powers to say who should be the government of Libya. But things got completely out of hand, and as an early contributor said quite correctly, why didn't we learn from Iraq? Why didn't we learn from that lesson that you can't just go into a country, overthrow effectively its leader, and then leave it in chaos? I mean, it was absolutely mad to go into that situation. But the situation at the moment is chaotic, and interestingly, you've asked on several occasions, is Libya one country? It's always been seen as having three distinct regions, but what's particularly challenging at the moment is it's not just the difference between those three distinct regions, it's little pockets of control within different regions. So if we think of Tripolitania, the reach of the government in Tripoli doesn't go out that far, and you don't have to travel much up into the mountains, into the Green Mountains, to find completely different groups in charge and basically total lawlessness. And that is a real lesson, I think, for Europe and for the Western world as a whole. You cannot blunder into a situation, even if you have good motives, and then expect things to work exactly.
Well, you say lesson, but they did exactly the same thing then in Syria. They sponsored 100,000 murderers, Uyghurs and Saudis and Chechens and so on, and sent them into Syria. And didn't Einstein say that the definition of madness was doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result?
That's correct. It was indeed what Einstein's saying. I think we have to accept, though, that in the Syrian case, most of the intervention was coming from Saudi Arabia, the UAE, very specific groups, individuals even, not necessarily always governments.
Yeah, but some of these extremist groups may not directly have been paid and oriented by Western governments, but insofar as they were paid and oriented by client states of these Western governments, the Western governments share responsibility, don't they? If our closest allies are paying head choppers and heart eaters and blood drinkers from every part of the world, we cannot wash our hands of that.
No, and I think if you ask many people in Syria and in Lebanon, as I've done myself, they will say, yes, there has been Western support, there is Western involvement. This is a history that's been going on for decades, if not centuries, but particularly since the breakup of the Ottoman Empire after the end of the First World War, constant involvement by Britain, France, and then latterly the United States as well. And indeed, in the Syrian case, of course, Turkey. And we shouldn't forget how much Turkey has been responsible for some of the things that has been going on and are still going on in Syria.
Q, our Turkish friend, if you'll forgive me, I know you can't speak for Turkey, but you're definitely the Turkey expert in this audience. Turkey, the Erdogan government had as its apparent policy no quarrels with the neighbors. That was the foreign policy enunciated by Davutoglu as the foreign minister, and it all ended up with not just quarrels with all the neighbors, but wars with many of the neighbors. What went wrong in Turkey's foreign policy?
Just to correct your assertion that the Erdogan and his government's policy, it wasn't to have no qualms with the neighbors. In fact, it was Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the founder of Turkish Republic, who asserted that phrase and continued as such until Erdogan came to power, assisted by the Western countries, when he then changed the whole constitution to suit his ambition and become Khalifa of the Islamic world. So that's
you think that's his intention, is
that was his intention, and still
that's not
remains
going
as
very
his,
well. It's not going very
well.
well.
Hasn't, because I think he rebounds from Egypt as well as Saudi Arabia, because
well, he failed in Syria, he's failed in Egypt, he's failed in Libya.
If he had remained as such to the constitution of 1924, that Turkey would have been not the first 20 prosperous countries in the world, but probably would have been in the first 10 if Mustafa Kemal Atatürk's philosophies and policies stayed in.
But even Erdogan said that he, and indeed did in the first part of his rule, he sought peace with the Kurdish minority. He had friendly relations with Syria, with Iraq, and even improved relations with Greece, and began talking about Cyprus. It seems that there was a turn somewhere in the Turkish government's foreign policy.
I would like to say this. I'm not conspiracy theorist, but in relation to Erdogan and Assad's relationship, when it started, they were two good friends. They holidayed together, they dined together, and in fact, they lifted the visa restrictions between the two countries, and they went so far as almost to have a joint cabinet meeting. I repeat, joint cabinet meeting between the two countries. But I want to move away from there, coming back to
Libya. Last words.
Last words. Haftar is a warlord. Haftar is not a state chairman. He cannot pick up a war with Turkey because Turkey is too powerful for him. Although he's supported by the Western countries, as we know for a fact, he has no guts to have a fight with Turkey because he sponsors Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Egypt, United States, and France. United Kingdom is abstaining at the moment, doesn't show anything. But to arrest 6 Turkish seamen, that's a piracy, which is a war crime. If he's a statesman, he should be tried in The Hague.
Well, the debate continues. I've been George Galloway. This has been كلمة on Al Mayadeen Television.